Good morning, everyone. Happy Palm Sunday. There you go. So, just a little useless trivia. Has anyone ever seen on Ash Wednesday people that have the ashes on the forehead? Okay. So, Palm Sunday, I grew up Catholic, so this is one of the reasons I know this. I know Catholic, Lutheran, I think Methodist, several of them. So what they do is Palm Sunday, they take the palms, and then the following year they burn the palms, and that's what they use for the ashes for Ash Wednesday. So there you go. You learned something today. If you haven't lived through it, now you know. And on a totally different but same note, our team just got back from Brazil. And do you know how many different palm trees there are in Brazil? Anyone? 40. You cheated. You got the note. But yes, there are 40 different palm trees in Brazil, and we know that because the team texted us and told us. So there we go. We can go home. We learned a lot of new stuff today, right? No, we're getting ready for Resurrection Sunday, and next week we're going to celebrate that and how important the resurrection is for us. When a couple of weeks ago, or last week, Nate went through how it's changed the world, Christianity, and it's always for the better, and just how important it is to us. And today, we're going to go into why would anyone make this up to prepare us for the evidence of the resurrection next week. So our big ideas is why would anyone make this up, and the reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. So this is to build your foundation of what you've hopefully set your life on. And there's a quote from Peter Kreeft. It says, "Why would the apostles lie? If they lied, what was their motive? What did they get out of it?" Well, what they got out of it was misunderstanding, rejection, persecution, torture, and martyrdom. Hardly a list of perks. So that's what they went through for a supposed lie. Now, we have a quick video from the Babylon Bee. It's a great video, and if we can get out of this video what I hope we can get, then we can just leave because it's my whole sermon wrapped up in this. So go ahead, Kendall.
I need 100% participation for this to work. Yeah, everyone's here. All 12, 11 of us. What's the plan? Well, as you know, Jesus is dead. But stick with me, stick with me. I have a plan. We are going to steal his body. Okay, I'm tracking with you. What's next? And then we're going to tell the whole world that he rose from the dead.
Oh, you know I'm in.
I will help.
All right, classic. Then what?
And then we're all going to get brother and brother.
Just go over that last part real quick.
Oh, what? We get murdered. What's the problem?
I like it. I like it. I mean, don't get me wrong, Pete. I love me a good hoax as much as the next guy, right? What's in it for us? Do we all get riches, fame, and fortune first, right?
No, get this. You're going to be hated, persecuted, and reviled for the rest of your life.
Okay, guys, fellas, look, I don't be missing something here, right? Okay? I mean, why on earth would we do this? Can we start over?
Okay, we'll start
In case you didn't know, John actually was sent to a deserted island. So, but that kind of shows the line of thinking is why? Why would they do this? Why would they make up a story? 2 Peter 1:16 says, "We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty." The apostles spent between 1.5 and 3 years with Jesus during his public ministry, and they were expecting him to proclaim his kingdom on earth. And we do that a lot in our walk, right? Our expectations of what God should do or is doing. And though they were disillusioned at his death, they became the first witnesses to the risen Jesus. And they endured persecution. Many experienced martyrdom, signing their testimony in their own blood. They willingly endangered themselves by publicly proclaiming the risen Christ. The strength of their conviction, marked by their willingness to die, indicates that they didn't lie or fabricate their claims. On the contrary, without exception, they actually believed Jesus to have risen from the dead. Blaise Pascal was a child prodigy in the 1600s, and he was one of the first two inventors of the mechanical calculator. And he was also a pioneer in the natural and applied sciences. And he once said, quote, "I only believe histories whose witnesses are ready to be put to the death." And that's the apostles. We're going off of their histories. And they were willing to be put to the death. And in a little bit, we're going to go into dying for what you think is the truth and dying for what you know is a lie. And while these, in and of themselves, these facts prove neither the truth of the resurrection nor Christianity as a whole, they do demonstrate the apostles' sincerity of belief, which lends credibility to their claims about the veracity of the resurrection. New Testament scholar Craig Keener says, quote, "The disciples' testimony was not fabricated. Ancients also recognized that the willingness of people to die for their convictions verified at least the sincerity of their motives, arguing against fabrication. People, of course, die regularly for values that are false. They do not, however, ordinarily die voluntarily for what they believe is false. Intentional deception by the disciples is thus implausible." So how do we know they didn't exaggerate or embellish what they're trying to say? Because if they lied, we can just throw out the New Testament. And next Sunday, we can just go hunt Easter eggs. But if they told the truth, then we have to throw out our excuses. And it's either one of the two. They lied or they told the truth. So let's go over some compelling reasons that we can be confident that the New Testament writers were telling the truth. So first, they include divergent details. Now, we covered this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about J. Warner Wallace and the police and how they know, eyewitness testimony is true. So we won't spend a lot of time on it today. But critics like to point to the unreliability of the New Testament because of contradictions. Now, when I was studying the truth for myself, trying to find out if the Bible was true, because if it wasn't, I wasn't going to follow it. Why waste my time? This was in my late teens and early 20s. I started with the contradictions in the Bible, because I always heard people say, well, there's so many contradictions in the Bible. The people I heard saying that never could tell me a contradiction, though, because I'd ask them, I'd say, well, which one are you talking? Just give me one. Well, I don't know of one, but everybody says there's contradictions. Okay, that doesn't fly. And then when I finally would find someone that would give a contradiction and I actually study it, and I'd find out, well, you're just reading it wrong, or there's an explanation if you read further in the chapter. There really were no contradictions in the Bible. None that I could find, and none that have been brought out in the, well, I won't tell you how many years since then, but I've searched and searched and searched. And anything that looked like a contradiction, if you just dive into it, you find out it's not a contradiction. So, there's a couple, but one big example that a lot of people use is Matthew says there's only one angel at the tomb of Jesus. And then John mentions two angels. So is this a contradiction that proves they were lying? No, just the opposite. Like we went over a few weeks ago, divergent details actually strengthen the case that they didn't get together and collude, that it's a true eyewitness account. Also, this is not a contradiction. Matthew does not say there is only one angel. You have to add a word to his account to turn it into a contradiction against John's. It's the same as two different reporters reporting the same event but giving different details in their stories. They'll record the event, Jesus rose from the dead, but differ on the details, how many angels were hanging around. Maybe Matthew mentioned only the angel that spoke in Matthew 28:5. Maybe John told of how many angels Mary saw, John 20:12. Or maybe because one angel was more prominent than the others. All we know is that differences as these are very common among eyewitnesses. And it's not the New Testament that's contradictory, it's the critics. On one hand, they'll claim that the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they tell many of the same stories in the same style, are too uniform to be independent sources. Then they claim they're too divergent to be telling the truth. So which is it? Are they too uniform or are they too divergent? You can't have it both ways. And it's actually the uniformity in the major outline of the story and the divergence in the details that lead people like J. Warner Wallace to say that's actually good eyewitness testimony. One of the other big things is the writers include embarrassing details about their enemies? No, about themselves. One of the ways historians can tell whether an author is telling the truth is the test by which he says is the principle of embarrassment, which states that if something is embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true. Why? Well, have you ever lied to make yourself look good? Yes, but have you ever lied to make yourself look bad? See, in all my lies, I'm like 6 foot, I'm chiseled, I have this cape on. You don't lie to make yourself look bad. You lie to make yourself look good. If you're making up a story that you want it to pass off as truth, would you make yourselves look dim-witted, uncaring, rebuked, doubting cowards? Of course not. That puts you in a bad light. But the New Testament writers included scores of embarrassing details about themselves, embarrassing to themselves and even embarrassing to their leader, Jesus. For example, this is how the writers portrayed themselves. This isn't someone else writing about them. This is them writing about themselves. They are dim-witted. Many times they fail to understand what Jesus is saying. Mark 9:32, Luke 18:34, John 12:16. So instead of showing how smart they are by getting what Jesus is saying and not having to ask for clarification, they point out they're dim-witted. Jesus has to tell them over and over again. They're uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. The New Testament said Jesus was buried in a Jewish tomb. Now, why would they not say that if they were making up the resurrection story? Because it's very easily verified. Also, his body was stolen, is what the Jews said. So that's an admittance that his body was buried there because they found it empty. So they had to come back and say it was stolen. They're rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. I mean, how much worse could it get? Were you going to make that up about yourself? Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. That's like in the middle of a sermon, Nate's given, and Andrew comes up and tells him, whoa, that's way off base there, Pastor. Peter is rebuked by Paul, and they write about it. They're cowards. You sure wouldn't include that if you were making something up. Peter denies Christ 3 times to a servant girl. They all run away and hide, minus John. The women are the brave ones in this story. Women discovered the empty tomb in all 4 Gospels. Now this, and you have to realize as we go through this, the period of history they were in and the type of society they lived in, and why some of this stuff you just wouldn't put in if you were making it up. Women discovered the empty tomb. They were not even allowed to be a witness at a trial. And yet they write that they discovered the empty tomb. And do you know why Jesus appeared to women first? Well, he needed to get the story out. That's true. They are doubters. Despite being told several times that Jesus would rise from the dead. John 2:18, 3:14, Matthew 12:39, 17:9, 22 through 23. They're still doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. After all of that, after 3 years of hearing Jesus talk about it. And then some are even doubtful after they see the risen Christ. Then there are embarrassing details about their leader. He's considered out of his mind by his own family who come to seize him and take him home in Mark 3:21. He's deserted by many of his followers in John 6:66. He's not believed by his own brothers in John 7:5. James didn't even believe until after the resurrection, and then he gave his life for that belief. And we know how that is. Anybody in here have a brother? Anybody have a brother that thinks he's God? So it's very easy to not believe him, right? But they put it in writing that they didn't believe him. He's thought to be a deceiver in John 7:12. He turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him in John 8:30 when he said, "Before Abraham I am." He's called a madman in John 10:20. He's called a drunkard in Matthew 11:19. He's called demon-possessed in Mark 3:22 and John 7:20. His feet are white with the hair of a prostitute in Luke 7:36. And you have to understand how unpolitically correct this was at the time. And yet they put it in. They're just relating what happened. There were 2 prostitutes in his genealogy, Tamar and Rahab. That's the bloodline of the Messiah. And they put that there were 2 prostitutes in there. There were murderers. There was a lot of nasty characters in his bloodline. He's crucified despite the fact that, quote, anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse in Deuteronomy 21:23. And they still put that in there. This is their leader. They're not trying to make him look good. They are just relating facts. Even the fact that the Jews wanted a Messiah who would free them from the Romans and not free them from their own sin. Their expectations were off. And as we go through the evidence for Christianity, remember that the majority of the claims of Christianity can be investigated and verified. In fact, all of the founders of modern science were Christians. They believed that investigating the creation provided evidence for the Creator. Bible-believing Christians realized that theology was the queen of all sciences and founded nearly all of our nation's first 100 or so universities. Harvard's charter stated that the purpose of one's studies was to know God and Jesus Christ. How far they've fallen. How far from the first love have they gotten? Most other world religions are just based on someone's philosophy of life, like Buddhism and Hinduism, or they make historical claims that can't be verified, or claims that were found false, like in Mormonism, or contradictory, like Islam. Christianity is the only one that the more people dig and the more they find out, the more it verifies the truth of what was written down. Every other religion, if you dig and dig and dig, it's contradictory or there's no proof at all. Like Mormonism, the hill Gomorrah. The Mormons bought the hill because they didn't want it excavated, because their own people excavated it and found nothing. And there was supposedly this huge society built on it. Christianity is the only one that is not scared of the truth. And then we have excruciating testimony. Testimony, that excruciating means out of the crucifixion or out of the cross. It's painful testimony that you know it's true because of how painful it is. The apostles and early believers were nearly all Jews except for Luke. When Jesus arrived in Israel, you have to understand the Jews had a nearly 2,000-year history, relationship with God of the universe. It was set in stone, literally. They knew who they were. The history was there. The rituals were there. There's no reason for them to change. They were God's chosen people with a rich tradition of religious practices. This group would have no motive to invent a new religion, and certainly no motive to invent one that would get them excommunicated from the synagogue and then beaten, tortured, and killed over a lie. But upon the alleged resurrection of Jesus, thousands of pious Jews changed their theology and historic religious practices almost overnight. And many of them paid the ultimate price for that, for affirming the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. So let's look at a few of the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection. So before, they had animal sacrifice. Afterwards, they had Christ's sacrifice. Before, they had the binding law of Moses, and after it was Christ's life. Before was strict monotheism, afterwards was the Trinity. Before was the Sabbath, and after was Sunday worship. Before was a conquering Messiah, afterwards was a sacrificial Messiah. Before was circumcision, afterwards was baptism and communion. Totally opposites. Flipping their world upside down. 2,000-year-old institutions they gave up. Animal sacrifice system, which had cleansed them of their sins for 2,000 years, was replaced forever by the sacrifice of Christ. The binding supremacy of the law of Moses is now powerless because of the sinless life of Christ. How many times did the Pharisees come up against Jesus with the law of Moses says, the law of Moses says? Their whole identity was wrapped up in that. Strict monotheism has been replaced with the Trinity, despite the fact that one, their most cherished belief has been, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," in Deuteronomy 6:4. And two, man worship has always been considered blasphemy and punishable by death. The Sabbath is no longer observed, even though they've always believed that breaking it was punishable by death. The Sabbath was so important to Jews that you can walk into the King David Hotel today and you'd have to use the stairs on Sabbath. Because if you went in the elevator and pushed the button and a spark happened, they'll say you're working. And you can't do any work on the Sabbath. That's how extreme it is today. Imagine what it was like back then. The belief in a conquering worldly Messiah, because they were under the yoke of Rome, is ditched for Jesus being a sacrificial lamb, at least on his first visit. He will conquer. And finally, the rite of circumcision to set them apart from the rest of the world gives way to baptism and communion to join them into one body. This might not seem like a lot to you, but you have to realize the time and place they were at and what it meant to give up all of that and turn to a new religion. And it's not just the New Testament writers who do this. Thousands of Jerusalem Jews, including the Pharisee priests, convert to Christianity and join the writers in abandoning these treasured beliefs and practices. See, sometimes we think, well, it was just these 12, and then the ones they preached to. Thousands and thousands. They turned the world upside down. And it started in Israel. For a lie? Because they stole some dead guy's body? Last week, Nate read a quote, and I read it the week before about Gamaliel, and he said, if these men are from God, leave them alone. If they're not from God, it's going to die out anyway. Has it died out? All these thousands of years later? Author J.P. Moreland shows the magnitude of these devout Jews giving up their established institutions overnight. When he says, quote, the Jewish people believed that these institutions were entrusted to them by God. They believed that to abandon these institutions would be to risk their souls being damned to hell after death. Now, a rabbi named Jesus appears from a lower class region. He teaches for 3 years, gathers a following of lower and middle class people, gets in trouble with the authorities, gets himself crucified along with 30,000 other Jewish men who are executed during this time period. But 5 weeks after he's crucified, over 10,000 Jews are following him and claiming that he is the initiator of a new religion. And get this, they're willing to give up or alter all 5 of the social institutions that they have been taught since childhood have such importance, both sociologically and theologically. Something very big was going on. Finally, in addition to abandoning long-held sacred institutions and adopting new ones, the New Testament writers suffered persecution and death when all they had to do was recant. They just had to say, no, he didn't rise. And they would have been set free. If they had made up the resurrection story, they certainly would have said so when they were about to be crucified like Peter, stoned like James, or beheaded like Paul. But no one recanted. 11 out of the 12 were martyred for their faith, with the 12th, John, exiled to a cave on the Greek island of Patmos, as we saw in the video. So why would they die for a known lie? Chuck Colson, he was former aide to President Nixon and founder of Prison Fellowship, has a great book, How Now Shall We Live? If you haven't read it, read it. It is a really good book. He went to prison over the Watergate scandal back in the 70s. Comparing his experience to that of the apostles, he writes, quote, Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up perpetrated by the closest aides to the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to their president. But one of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence. That is, he testified against Nixon, as he put it, to, quote, save his own skin. And he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks. And then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now, the fact is, all these men surrounding the president were facing maybe embarrassment, maybe a short prison stay. They weren't facing death and torture. Nobody's life was at stake. But the disciples, 12 powerless men, really just peasants, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stoning, and execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think one of them would have cracked under the pressure? At least one of them? Peter, maybe, because he ran away from that servant girl. None of them did. Not a single one. They would have cracked to save themselves. If the resurrection was a hoax, they would have saved themselves. So what could have caused pious believers, they were devout Jewish men, what would have caused them to give up everything on that one column for everything on the other virtually overnight? It's something that psychologists call an impact event. An impact event is something that is so big and makes such an emotional impact on your life that you remember what happened for the rest of your life. It changes your life dramatically. For example, how many people in here can remember what you were doing November 22nd, 1963? Anyone? Yeah, you weren't alive. Okay, so first service, we had several people raise their hands. That means all the old people in first service. Because if they can remember what they were doing in 1963, they're old. Let's try something a little more for this crowd. What about September 11, 2001, when the second plane hit? Do you remember what you were doing? I remember to a T what I was doing that day. I was in a meeting at work, and the phone rang, and it was BJ telling me a plane hit, and then she called a little while later and said a second plane hit, and I told her to bring a TV up to work because you couldn't watch it on your phone or on your watch, or you had to have this thing called a TV. So she brought a TV up, and the rest of that day we were watching what happened. That was an impact event. I will probably remember it for the rest of my life. So do you think if you were with Jesus for 3 years and he was murdered and he rose again, would that be an impact event in your life? Would it be an impact event for the apostles? Do you think they would remember everything that surrounded that event and would write about it, would want to get the word out to people, that they'd be willing to write embarrassing things about themselves because that was the truth and they wanted people to have the truth about Jesus raising from the dead? Why else would they have abandoned everything that they knew, everything that their forefathers knew? Everything that they thought they knew about God. What did they have to gain by making up a new religion? Excommunication, beatings, tortures, being killed. They had every motive to say the resurrection didn't happen, but they became martyrs for the truth. Now, let's get something straight. Being a martyr does not make something true. That's been a fallacy too many people have thought. Being a martyr in itself does not make something true. The New Testament martyrs are in a different classification because they were in a position to know whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. In other words, they verified with their own lives that it wasn't a lie. On the other hand, Muslim martyrs are dying for something they think is the truth, where the apostles would have been dying for something they know is a lie if they had made up the story. Do you see the difference? Today, if I were to be killed for my faith in Jesus, I would be a martyr for something I believe to be true. They weren't. They were martyrs for something they knew to be true. Big difference. And while we're talking about that, I hate to use the term martyr for Muslim terrorists. The guys that flew the planes into the towers were not martyrs. Martyrs die for their belief. They suffer for their belief. They don't kill other people. There's a difference. So many people will die for a lie they think is the truth, but no one will die for a lie that they know is a lie. Acts 10:39 says, "And we are witnesses of all things which he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they killed by hanging on a tree. God raised him up on the third day and then showed him openly." Then we have evidence from the Old Testament prophecy. So if you're a Jew back in that time, the Old Testament prophecy about your coming Messiah, if he starts to check off the boxes, then that's a big deal, because the Old Testament told them what to look for in their coming Messiah. And there are hundreds of claims that predicted Jesus in the Old Testament. But we only need to cite a handful of passages to make a good case that the apostles knew Jesus was the awaited Messiah. Genesis 3:15, that he would be born of the seed of a woman. Everyone else is born of the seed of man. Jeremiah 23:5 and 33:15, he is in the line of David. Micah 5:2, he would be born in Bethlehem. Isaiah 9:6, he'd be both God and man. Malachi 3:1, he visits the temple, which, by the way, had to be before AD 70, because what happened in AD 70? The temple was destroyed. Daniel 9:24, he would die in the 1st century, say around 33 AD. And Isaiah 53, he is a sacrifice. The worship team can make their way up. The story of Jesus saturates the narrative of the whole Bible, and prophecies of his first advent are found throughout the Old Testament. One scholar, J. Barton Payne, has found as many as 574 verses in the Old Testament that somehow point to or describe or reference the coming Messiah. Alfred Edersheim has found 456 Old Testament verses referring to the Messiah or his times. So conservatively, Jesus fulfilled at least 300 prophecies in his earthly ministry. But the odds of Jesus fulfilling just 7 that we read are astronomical. The mathematical probability that one person could fulfill all of the prophecies is beyond comprehension. There's not even a number for it. But MIT calculated the odds of Jesus fulfilling just 8 prophecies, and the result was 1 in 100 trillion. Now that's a lot of zeros. So it'd be more like this. It'd be like taking silver dollars, covering the whole state of Texas, 2 feet deep in silver dollars. And you have one marked silver dollar somewhere. Could be San Antonio, Amarillo, Dallas, anywhere. You have one marked silver dollar, 2 feet deep across the entire state, taking someone blindfolded, setting them down in the middle of the state and saying, go find that silver dollar. You get one try with the blindfold on to find that marked silver dollar. That's the odds of someone fulfilling just 8 of the prophecies. And Jesus fulfilled over 300. You have to know what your faith is built on. Because storms will come, and if it's on sand, your house will crumble. The apostles knew that Jesus was the risen Messiah. We can know through their eyewitness testimony, through historical records, through fulfilled prophecy, and through the Holy Spirit that Jesus died for our sins and rose again to offer us freedom from sin. You can make that your foundation just as the apostles did. Then when persecution comes, when abandonment comes, when all the storms of life that come against you, you know that it is not a made-up story. You know that he rose again from the dead, because these men who were there to see it, who knew whether he did or didn't, gave their lives for it and wrote it down so you would have no excuse. They knew Jesus rose from the dead. The question now is, what do you do with that same knowledge in your own life?